So just a short introduction to what our committee actually does, because we are fairly unique in European terms, meaning that our committee, the Foreign Policy Committee, is actually mentioned in the Danish Constitution. So it actually states quite clearly that the Danish government, has to seek advice and consultation from my committee every time they make any decisions regarding foreign affairs and security-related issues. So we believe ourselves to be fairly well important, but also fairly well briefed. But besides all that, besides my 19 years in the Danish Parliament, I worked intensively also in the Council of Europe, as Charlotte mentioned, where primarily I was a rapporteur on Georgia for 5 years. And also, just before I became chairman of the Foreign Policy Committee here in Denmark, I was actually chairman of the so-called Monitoring Committee inside the Council of Europe, which monitors all the Eastern European countries that are developing into a full-fledged democracy. So I've followed Georgia a lot. I've been to Georgia many times, and therefore it's in light of that I also will try to tell you a bit about how I see the situation in Georgia developing. And first of all, the most important question perhaps is, why are we so focused on Georgia? You know, there are a lot of countries to be focused on. And I think, well, I can only speak for myself, I think that one of the things that, are of great importance for us is that we can actually, feel how it is perhaps to be Georgia. Georgia is a small country, just next to a very big country that is pressuring them a lot. So even though Denmark is a bit bigger than Georgia, we are also still a small country in every sense. So we have been following Georgia a lot. And since the 2008 war from Russia, where Russia occupied a huge part of Georgia, we've also tried to see how can we help Georgia fulfill its goals. And there are a lot of goals that we still need Georgia to fulfill. Even though Georgia, since its independent years, have developed a lot, for example, in the fight against corruption. I don't know how many who have actually been to Georgia, but if you come to Georgia, try to visit a police station in Georgia. Not because I want you to get arrested, but because it's actually quite a funny thing. Because all police stations in Georgia have huge windows. And you're like, well, they like the view? Well, actually, it's anti-corruption benefit. And why is that? Well, the former president, Saakashvili, mentioned to me, because I asked him, why? And he said, well, it's because we want it to become as impossible as possible to accept a bribe in a police station office. And if people outside can watch in, it's quite impossible to get, a huge envelope or suitcase of money with no people observing that. So that's actually one of the things people can, say, well, does that fight corruption? Well, it tries to, and that is, of course, a good step in the right direction. But we must also not kid ourselves. There are still problems with corruption in Georgia, and therefore one of the biggest improvements that we are trying to help Georgia fulfill is actually to fight even more corruption. Because since 10 years ago, Denmark has actually tried to see what kind of focus countries are there in Europe that we want to help. We have a lot of foreign aid programs around the world, primarily in Africa, but we also want to help countries in Europe. And therefore, we have chosen 3 countries. We've chosen Moldova, we've chosen Ukraine, and we've chosen Georgia. 3 countries that are being threatened daily by Russia. 3 countries that we want to develop into EU countries and NATO countries, but also 3 countries that need our help. So we're actually allocating even more funds through the years, and we allocated a lot of funds, for example, in the fight against corruption. And then you could end there and say, well, everything is going according to plan, right? Everything is going good, and we have a government that is actually going in the right direction for actually achieving EU candidate country status, and that's a good thing. But I must also be frank with you, that there are still some also worrying trends in Georgia. that we among friends and also to our Georgian friends have to be frank about. Especially in light after the horrific full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, where Russia were more and more isolated. We were also hoping that our European friend, Georgia, would also try to achieve that goal. They have not. They have actually gone the opposite direction. If you look on what happened since the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, we have actually seen a very worrying trend that Georgia is actually becoming more and more dependent on Russia. We have seen just the first half of 2023, Russia were actually responsible for 14.2% of Georgia's GDP, the highest level in 16 years. We've seen that 500,000 visitors from Russia were actually visiting Georgia in the first half of that year. We've seen the import of Russian oil products are being actually 500% increased compared to before the war in Ukraine. So the Russian import to Georgia is at the highest level since 2007. And why is 2007 important? You all remember the war in 2008. Georgia export to Russia, wine export is actually also at its high level. That is a good thing. Georgia wine is good. But it also sends you a signal that something perhaps is not as good as it should be. The number of Russian tourists have increased a lot. They're not welcomed in many countries, but they're welcomed in Ukraine. And actually also the number of Russian... Sorry. I like that you actually see if I say something wrong. That's good. So you're awake. That was a test. But exactly. And then also the number of Russian companies in Georgia that is being established is at its highest level in many, many years. Georgia is also one of the few countries that Russia actually can still fly into, besides, for example, Turkey. But all other European countries are closed off its direct flights. And just to put it into perspective, it was just after we opened our embassy in Georgia that actually opened. Why am I mentioning all this? Is it to put a drag? No. But it also to say quite clearly that I have a sense that the population of Georgia, the population in a huge majority, really want to be a full-fledged European democracy. They want to be part of Europe, they want to be part of the European Union, they want to be a part of NATO. No question about it. But we also have to tell the government of Georgia that you also have to show it. So when you put forward a proposal of the so-called foreign agent, meaning that every NGO that have a funding of over 20% from abroad, you have to register as a foreign agent, that's not a good proposal. That actually put into perspective that's something that should happen in Russia, not in Georgia. And thankfully for the population of Georgia, with a huge outcry, huge demonstrations, the government withdrew that proposal. But not until the huge demonstration and the outcry from countries like, for example, ours. So what I mean by all of this is that Georgia is really on a good path, but we still need to steer it in the right direction. We want to help. We opened our embassy just over a year ago. So we want to help it in any ways, but the government of Georgia also has to show its willingness, not only 80%, but 100%. And therefore, I always ask, for example, when the foreign minister of Georgia visited Copenhagen some months ago, I told him quite clearly when he visited my committee, I told him, we are friends of Georgia. We want to help you, but you also have to be willing to accept our help. And you also have to show your willingness to be a completely European country. So, to sum up, the Georgian people are liberal and Western-minded. They are ready for the EU. However, the will of the people is being somewhat diminished by the actions of the government. The lack of sanctions against the warmongering state of Russia is not only disappointing, but is also in direct opposition of Georgia's efforts and willingness to become a member of EU. So I want Georgia, with all my heart, to become a member of both the EU and NATO. Georgia should contribute positively to both alliances. There's no question about that. And Georgia, of course, could also benefit from it greatly themselves. But there are still things that have to change in a more positive direction. We need even more democratized society where the different parties do not fight among themselves, as we've seen through the last couple of years. We need completely free and transparent elections, and we need a complete showdown with corruption and a willingness to follow suit with the EU sanctions packages against Georgia. If the Georgian government says yes to all of this, there is no end where it could only, well, there is that end that it could actually see Georgia become a full-fledged European country. But the Georgian government has to say yes to all of this. So thank you for that, and I think we have time for some questions.
Thank you. Yes, and quite a speech, Michael. But we have approximately 10 minutes for questions. So if there are some questions to Michael Aastrup, and I don't know if there is a microphone, but if you raise just and tell who you are.
I'm the International Director at CRINFO, which is the Danish Center for Gender and Equality. We have the pleasure of working in Georgia for a couple of years, and I'm very pleased that you mentioned that the NGO law has created some mistrust. And I wanted to hear what you, in a way I feel like that's the biggest challenge, the mistrust, or you can say the social contract between those in power and those who they represent. How can the government of Georgia fix that? And is that something you have discussed with the colleagues from the government of Georgia? Thanks.
Well, an excellent question. Well, we try to be as frank as possible. You know, we're not diplomats, so we try to be quite clearly outspoken. Even though that's not a bad thing about diplomats. Don't worry, ambassadors. So yes, we have been quite clear in this. We have stated that the NGO law was completely unacceptable, period. I'm glad that the government has withdrawn that proposal. And I'm also quite clear in our, let's say it like it is, demands that if Georgia should be a member of the European Union, no proposals like that should be allowed to come from the Georgian government. So yes, we've been quite clear on that.
Yes, are there more questions? Yeah, behind there.
Torben Ravn, formand for Georgiens venner i Danmark. I like Georgia, like all people here, I believe. I don't like the Georgian government, but I must say I understand the Georgian government, because if you have Putin as a neighbor, you have to be careful. And I think the government's primary priority is to keep Georgia as a country. EU and NATO, we can't help Georgia if Putin comes.
Well, also an excellent question. You all have excellent questions, by the way. I fully understand. We saw it in 2008. Georgia is an extremely small country, so if Russia have the capacity but also willingness to go in and invade a full-fledged invasion of Georgia, like for example we see in Ukraine today, it will be impossible, of course, for Georgia to stop that invasion. And you know, I visited the ABL line in Georgia many times. I've seen the worrying trends that Russia through the years have expanded the ABL line. So they're actually occupying more and more territories of Georgia. And we've seen the different skirmishes and other worrying trends.
Michael, Could you explain what the ABL
Yeah, of course. The administrative borderline, I think the correct line is, and that is the unofficial border between the occupied territories and Georgia. This line is being moved by Russia. And that is, of course, extremely worrying. And therefore, I understand the necessity in trying to not poke the bear, so to speak. I fully understand that. I really do. You know, we were in somewhat similar situations, perhaps in the 30s. But let's also be frank, that didn't help us. So you also have to say, I don't think this balance is somewhat balanced right now. I think there is an imbalance to this, and that's what I'm trying to raise. But I understand the problem. I understand the situation. Absolutely, I do. So that's why we want to help Georgia become a European Union member as soon as possible, because that will help Georgia. We know that helped the Baltic states, so that there's no invasion of the Baltic states right now. And that could also help Georgia a lot.